suspect, none of them preventing the school massacre, and the movement now started by surviving Parkland students for tighter gun control laws. And top secret, John Kelly's crackdown begins this week on White House staffers holding temporary security clearances, what it means for people who already handle sensitive material like the president's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner. We're going to look at that straight ahead. But first, it was a busy night and morning of tweeting for the president. From his winter White House, President Trump posted about a dozen impassioned social media rants, most attacking the FBI, Russia's investigation. His comments in response to Friday's indictments, charging 13 Russians with a multi-million-dollar operation of trying to interfere in the 2016 elections. Their intent to boost support for then-candidate Trump in an effort to hurt the Clinton campaign. We've got team coverage, but let's start with our White House correspondent, Jeff Bennett. Jeff is down in Florida for us. Jeff, let's begin with what the White House is saying about those Russia indictments that were announced on Friday. Not really, not a lot of comments coming out of the White House, a lot from the president on Twitter, though.
Yeah, and Eamon, first I would mention that I'm speaking to you from the Parkland Amphitheater. It's the site of a memorial for the 17 people who were murdered this past week at that high school shooting. So I'm keeping my voice down just a bit out of deference to the people here paying their respects. But to your question, look, the White House says, as the president does, that there was no collusion between his campaign and Russia. And what we've seen are White House officials echo the comments that we've seen in the president's tweet, trying to extract details from the special counsel indictment and the comments that we heard from Rod Rosenstein, and trying to spin whatever they can to give the suggestion that the president is somehow in the clear. Although we know that the special counsel probe continues apace, the collusion part of it carries on, and so there could be another indictment to come, Eamon. What we have not heard yet is any sort of clear plan of response from the president about how he intends to retaliate against Russia and how he intends to thwart Russian attempts to interfere in the 2018 midterms, as that is the overwhelming consensus of his own intelligence chiefs.
Yeah, and as everyone is saying, Jeff, they're warning of 2018 and the possibility that it will happen again, as we heard this week in various intelligence briefings. Let me ask you really quickly about the president, who's been accusing the FBI of missing some key piece of information and leads on the Parkland shooter because they're, quote, spending too much time trying to prove Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. Has the White House followed up on this statement or clarified what the president actually meant in those tweets?
No, they haven't. And as they often say, the president's tweets speak for themselves. So I'll read the tweet for you. He writes this: "Very sad that the FBI missed all of the many signals sent out by the Florida school shooter. This is not acceptable. They are spending too much time trying to prove Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. There is no collusion. Get back to the basics and make us all proud." Now, there's no reason to believe the FBI's failures have anything to do with the Russia investigation. The FBI openly admits it dropped the ball. It did not act on the many warnings it received about the shooter. This appears to be, Eamon, a case of the president amplifying partisan talking points. We understand he spent the day at Mar-a-Lago. He chose not to golf today out of respect, we're told, for the Florida shooting victims and their families. And so, based on his tweets, we know that he's watching cable TV, and this was one that he sent earlier today.
And Jeff, finally, let me, before I let you go, let me ask you about a meeting that was scheduled to take place today with House Speaker Paul Ryan and the president. He's down there in Florida. Do we have any more information about the meeting, what they discussed, what came out of it?
We're still waiting to get details on exactly what they talked about. I can tell you, going into that meeting, we expected them to talk about the legislative agenda for the rest of the year. At the top of the president's agenda, Eamon, is infrastructure, although Republicans privately say they don't expect that to go anywhere this year, in particular because it is an election year. They're also talking about ways to sell the GOP tax cut plan. That plan is not anywhere near as popular as Republicans want, in part because they think they haven't sold it correctly. And frankly, if the two of them are going to have any kind of conversations about proposals to end gun violence, to stop the kind of mass shootings that we saw here in Florida this past week, that would have been a good opportunity to have that conversation. We'll find out if the two did. I can tell you, though, that when the president returns to Washington, he is going to have two meetings focused on ways to stop school violence. He's going to meet with high school teachers and students, and then he's going to meet with state and local officials. Eamon.
All right, NBC's Jeff Bennett live for us in Florida. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. And obviously, with Russia being the center of attention, both in the indictments as well as the president's tweets overnight, let's cross over now to Moscow, Russia, and bring in Richard Engel, NBC News' chief foreign correspondent, who's got more for us from there. Richard?
Ayman, when you look into these 13 names, the individuals who are named in the special prosecutor's indictment, they tell a fascinating story, a spy story. the most important name on that list is someone who in this country is nicknamed Putin's chef, Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is called the chef, not because he actually cooks for the Kremlin. He runs a major catering company in this country, a rags to riches story. He started out, according to his own telling of his personal history, selling hot dogs in St. Petersburg after the collapse of the Soviet Union, then went on to open an elite restaurant, or a restaurant for elites, and now has a huge catering company that survives primarily on state contracts, providing catering services to schools, the military, the Kremlin, also to state banquets, including for visiting U.S. presidents. But according to this U.S. indictment, it's not just catering services that Prigozhin provides. He also does special tasks for the Kremlin, including the disinformation campaign that the indictment says was influential, and that the inflammation campaign was designed to disparage Hillary Clinton, to discredit her campaign, and help then candidate Donald Trump. And the reason experts here say that the Kremlin would want to use an oligarch like Prigozhin would be to give them plausible deniability, to carry out special tasks on behalf of the Kremlin without implicating the Kremlin directly. Ayman?
All right, thank you very much to NBC's Richard Engel. We want to bring you some breaking news that has just emerged in the last hour or so. Breaking news coming out of the Los Angeles Times, which is reporting that Rick Gates, former top aide to Donald Trump's presidential campaign, will accept a plea deal, pleading guilty to fraud charges, and has said that he is willing to testify against his former boss, Paul Manafort. And just to emphasize, that is again being reported by the LA Times this afternoon. Let's bring in our panel to get some reaction to this breaking news. First off, Paul Butler, MSNBC legal analyst, former federal prosecutor and professor at the Georgetown School of Law. Naveed Jamali, former FBI double agent and author of the book, How to Catch a Russian Spy. Natasha Bertrand, staff writer at The Atlantic, covering national security and intelligence. And Kurt Vidala, former Breitbart spokesman and columnist for the Huffington Post. Paul, let me begin with you, if I may, and just get your reaction. We'll go around the table, get everyone's reaction to this news that the LA Times is reporting that Rick Gates intends to plead guilty to the charges that we were saying there, also intends to, according to the LA Times, cooperate with the prosecution and testify against Paul Manafort. When you're the special counsel building that case, what is your reaction to this news?
It's all about Paul Manafort and what he knows. And apparently he is not being cooperative with the special counsel. He's exercising his constitutional right to go to trial. At the end of the day, 95% of people who are charged with crimes end up pleading guilty. Manafort looks like he needs a lot of pressure, but Mueller seems to think he's got the goods on somebody higher up in the chain. This was a campaign manager. He was present in a lot of these meetings and about contacts with Russians. So Mueller really wants to know what Manafort knows, and Gates, his business partner, is the key to Manafort.
Let me ask you really quickly, though. Is surprised that Rick Gates initially pleaded not guilty, and then a couple of months since entering that plea of not guilty, has now changed and said he would plead guilty?
You know, it happens all the time. Again, when you are charged with a crime, the defense attorney always recommends plead not guilty. Let's see what kind of deal we can get. And here's the thing, Gates reportedly isn't getting a great deal. No matter what, he's going to have to do at least 18 months in prison. Mm-hmm. And so, again, that suggests that Mueller has a lot of evidence against Gates as well. So he's got a strong bargaining chip. And we only have to think, if this is what Gates knows, what does Manafort know?
Natasha, let me ask you, these are two men that work together very closely on a whole host of issues. The allegations is that they were illegally representing the Ukraine with their, political interests here in the United States, their financial interests. What is the significance of this announcement by the LA Times that Rick Gates intends to plead guilty now?
Well, the White House has said that this will not have any impact on Trump or his inner circle in the White House, but there are a lot of reasons why that is not true, of course, because Manafort and Gates were the ones essentially running the Trump campaign during the summer of 2016. Of course, that's when a lot of consequential things happened with regard to Russia. You had the Trump Tower meeting that, of course, Manafort attended. You had this change in the RNC's platform with regard to Ukraine that, of course, would, be fair game for for Mueller to ask Gates about, for Mueller to ask Manafort about. So the fact that Gates now is cooperating with the special counsel and plans to tell the special counsel everything that he knows about Manafort, including, perhaps things that went on during the campaign, should really be making the White House pretty nervous.
Naveed, let me ask you in terms of what may have changed that got Rick Gates to change his plea from not guilty a few months ago to now one of possibly guilty in order to cooperate with the federal prosecutor, or the special prosecutor, I should say, against Manafort.
I think in this case, it sounds like from the LA Times reporting that this was a question of economics. To mount a defense against this is simply a costly endeavor, and there's always the chance that at the end of it, you may still be found guilty. So I think that what the calculus here is that, he's looking at some significant jail time, even as the other panelists mentioned, he's down to 18 months. I think that there's an incentive for him to cooperate, potentially to save his money and perhaps reduce the risk that he's faced here. If I could just put one final point, though.
Yeah.
The thing that intrigues me about this is this a question, when it comes to Manafort, is this a question of crimes that don't necessarily have to do with the core Russia investigation, or is there a nexus? So if he's in fact guilty of, say, money laundering, does that actually play into this Russia collusion investigation? That's something we don't know here. And again, that's a $64,000 question.
And I just want to recap for everyone that this is according to the LA Times. And it's important to emphasize that the LA Times itself is also reporting that Gates' defense lawyer, Thomas C. Green, did not respond to a message left by phone and email. And Peter Carr, who is the spokesman for the special counsel, Robert Mueller, has declined to comment. This was on, at least on Saturday. If I can, Kurt, your reaction to this developing news?
For an investigation that Donald Trump swears up and down, left and right, on Twitter constantly, that there's nothing there. There's not a there, there's no campaign complicity, there's no inappropriate action. There are sure a lot of people pleading guilty right now to Robert Mueller. There are a lot of people who have committed wrongdoing. And that leads me to believe that there's something there, and that Mueller is, again, the key might be Manafort to get to Trump, and he's flipped Gates to get to Manafort. But at the end of the day, all of these people, the campaign manager, the deputy campaign manager, the former national security advisor of the United States, Michael Flynn, Papadopoulos, all these actors were doing wrongdoing, and if Trump didn't know about it, that begs the question of what kind of management does he have? This is someone who has made in a case that decisions are made at the top. People should be held responsible. He constantly attacked Barack Obama if something went wrong and Obama didn't know about it. The same standard really applies to Trump. If all these things were going on and all this wrongdoing was being committed and Trump didn't know about it, he's criminally negligent. If he did know about it, he's just criminal.
Let me pick up on that point that Kurt was just mentioning there. The president, in all of these individuals who have pled guilty or have been brought forward in front of the special prosecutor facing indictments, have either been dismissed as insignificant players or that they were just part of the campaign on a short period of time, not people who knew the inner workings, didn't have a lot of influence in the case of George Papadopoulos. But when you really look at these individuals, National Security Advisor, Paul Manafort was the chairman of the Trump campaign for a brief period. Significant players now in the crosshairs of the special prosecutor. What does that say?
That makes me think of this indictment that came out on Friday against these 13 Russian operatives. Purely symbolic, because we don't have an extradition treaty with Russia, so those folks will never see the inside of a federal courtroom. It's a speaking indictment. So Mueller was telling a story about how the Russians tried to hack the election, how they tried to throw it to Donald Trump. And the question is, what did Trump know? What did other campaign officials know? The indictment does not allege that there was any collusion at this point, but there was a press conference that Rod Rosenstein had on Friday where he said something very significant. He says there's no evidence of collusion in this indictment,
right?
Meaning that I think we can expect something further down the line.
And Natasha, again, when we go back to the relationship between Rick Gates and Paul Manafort, that's now certainly one that's going to become of tremendous interest. Not that the special prosecutor had not already focused on it, but from the outside looking in, when you see somebody like Rick Gates potentially pleading guilty, how much pressure does that now put on Paul Manafort? How much pressure does that put on him to either cooperate or potentially, move up the food chain and turn somebody higher above him to the special prosecutor?
A lot of pressure. Rick Gates and Paul Manafort worked together for well over a decade. They worked together extremely closely. He was essentially Paul Manafort's deputy in all things, in business and everything during the campaign. So this is definitely going to make Paul Manafort think twice about whether or not he actually wants to cooperate with Robert Mueller, because of course now we see that he's exercising his right to go to trial, and he has not decided to move forward with a plea deal. But this is the way that these things work, right? You flip Rick Gates, and then ultimately maybe you get to Paul Manafort, and then you see what Paul Manafort perhaps has on a bigger fish, perhaps even like the president.
Yeah, and it's important to emphasize that there were issues that Paul Manafort and Rick Gates purportedly supported that ultimately made their way to then candidate President Trump, on policy issues, particularly with the issue of Ukraine. Naveed, explain to us, if you can, the significance of that. What was it that Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, in terms of their lobbying practices on behalf of pro-Russian Ukraine elements, how that would have factored in to the big picture that people are saying that the president, and even as a candidate, was pursuing policies favorable to Russia and not necessarily the longstanding traditions and practices of the U.S.?
Well, that's a great question. Let me just first start by answering this. In my experience with Russia, there are two types of people that Russia seeks to recruit. One are what is known as intelligence assets. Those are people that can provide information to them. And the second is people that are in a position of trust and confidence. This is sort of a universal statement, but the idea here for that second tranche is that they're going to look for people who are in a position to impact and affect policies or decisions that are beneficial to Russia. So in fact, to act as an agent of Russia in a position that could shape things like policy. So now to go back to your question, there's a lot of debate and there's been a lot of innuendo, and very clearly there's a fact pattern here that goes to the fact that in the height of the campaign, the GOP changed its platform towards the concept of whether Russia should suffer sanctions or their policy towards the aggressive actions towards Russia and the Ukraine. And, when you have someone like Paul Manafort, who worked in that sphere, has ties to Russia in terms of just decades of business, it goes back to my point of this idea that is there the opportunity here for the Russians to have potentially targeted and, in fact, recruited someone who is in a position of trust and confidence. And I think, again, that is the core question here. We saw the 13 Russians indicted in Russia who are not going to set foot into an American courtroom, but are there Americans involved? My experience tells me that there absolutely have to have been.
And Kurt, when you look at this from the White House perspective, and as we were just talking here with Paul, at the time that Rick Gates and Paul Manafort were indicted, the White House's argument at the time was these are charges that happened before Paul Manafort and Rick Gates were ever involved in the campaign. No significance whatsoever to the Trump campaign and to the Trump presidency. Now that, though, he is pleading guilty, is the White House going to be nervous about this, that Paul Manafort, the person indicted out of the four that we've mentioned, Mike Flynn, George Papadopoulos, Rick Gates, he now is the only one that has not pleaded guilty. The others are intending to plead guilty?
Well, I think that the White House, while publicly may not say a whole lot about this and continue to try to dismiss it and smear Mueller, the reality is this has to be incredibly concerning to them to know that, again, another person that was close to this campaign, that was in a higher leadership position, to know a lot of things, is pleading guilty, and that there's even more pressure now on Manafort to flip on Trump. And you count on one hand the number of people now who are left standing who had close proximity to the president and haven't had to plead to something yet. That number is dwindling by the day. Steve Bannon this past week was reported spent 20 hours with Robert Mueller answering questions, answering every question, as a matter of fact, that was asked of him. The more that this goes on, the deeper that we get into this investigation, the more it's becoming very clear that Donald Trump is a person who doesn't have a whole lot of allies that are willing to go to jail for him. And that's why all these people who are facing Robert Mueller right now are flipping on him, because at the end of the day, none of this is worth their freedom.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out in the coming days ahead. And important to emphasize, again, this is the LA Times reporting this within the last couple of hours, that former Trump aide Rick Gates intends to plead guilty and even agrees to testify against Paul Manafort. Very significant developments. I want to thank Naveed Jamali, Natasha Bertrand, Kurt Berdala. Paul Butler, I'm going to ask you to stick around for a little bit longer with us. Because we are following breaking news, and the LA Times reporting that former Trump campaign aide Rick Gates will accept a plea deal from special counsel Robert Mueller. We'll have a lot more on the significance of all of this. Stay with us.
As long as there is fear, as long as there is curiosity, as long as there are undiscovered corners of the earth, and as long as there is willingness and desire, then you are capable of more.